now into the next topic, which the next topic was how do we implement that second list? So what I'd started off on, I guess, Wednesday is I added the second dropdown for all that says all movies, my votes, my upvotes, my downvotes, right? I want to have the opportunity to filter it down to just the movies that I voted on and not just all the movies, right? So how do I want to implement that? There's actually more than one way to go about that. There's more than one way to implement that second dropdown. Okay, do I have everybody's attention? And it basically branches into two categories. And this is two general categories that you can solve kind of any problem with Firebase, okay? You can either do it on the client or you can do it on the server, right? You can have the database do that work, or you can have the client do that work. So bear with me there. So I can either try to take the results, right? Take the list of movies and the list of votes and somehow blend that together into one list and do that on the client. Or I can somehow have the server try to do that merge. Okay, so with SQL, we would do that with, say, a join statement potentially on the server. We might do a join clause, an inner join, and say, inner join the votes with the movies, right? And that would get me one result set that only contains those things. We don't have that option because we're not in SQL world. Yes?
Can you do it on the side, the best option, and then have choice?
You said if what?
Wouldn't that be like a better option?
To do it on the, you said on the server side?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. It's not a strict for sure. There's a lot of trade-offs. Is part of what I want to talk about. So we could do a join if we're working with a SQL database. We could do that on the server. I don't have that option, but I can still do it on the server, right? So if I was trying to get this work done on the server, how would I accomplish that? How could I get from the server just the movies that I've voted on? Yeah.
You would have to ask for the movie votes collection.
Okay.
With your name in it.
Yep.
Username or whatever it holds. And that'll give you all the votes that you've made, positive and negative.
Yep.
And does the movie votes collection also contain the movie name or not?
That's a good question. You're asking the right question. Okay. Let me put something on the board then. So if I say db.collection, this is one method to get that list. Movie votes. So if I say, let's just run that query, that's going to give me a document for, actually I need the where in there. Where equal to. Where equal to. Put that in as username. So I run this query. That will give me the right documents, the right number of documents. So if I have 5 movies I voted on, this will give me 5 results. Okay, that much is true. The next question you asked, is that all the data that I need, right? Does that give me all of the pieces? And it may or may not, right? So you're saying, does it contain the name? Depends on how I set up my schema. Does that make sense? So if I put the name in there when I inserted the document, yes, then it contains the name of the movie. If I didn't choose to do that, then no, it doesn't, right? So it really depends on what I did when I inserted the movie, right? So if when I inserted the movie, I included all of the summary data that I need, then that's enough, right? So for this being enough, what data does it need to include? Well, in terms of what's in movie votes, in order for that to work, I have to have the username, I have to have the movie ID. What other pieces of data do I have to render that list?
The image.
The image, okay. So I need to know the image I'm going to display.
The
What else?
director.
Huh?
The director.
The director, and we also talked about and put it on the list. The name, and you're right, I need the director because I'm showing the director. Any other pieces of data that I'm showing? The vote, which would be the, remember the value. So we're also including that in there. Is that all the data I need to write? Yep, the genre, because I'm showing that. Okay. Do I have all my data represented? No. What else? Yep.
I guess like the actual movie name.
Got it?
Release here.
Release here. Yeah. So and so I also need that piece of data. Right. So if all of that data is in the vote document, I'm done. Does that make sense? But the data that I need to put in here is based on what I'm showing in the UI, right? So I have to kind of have foreknowledge of what I'm going to put in the summary. If that ever changes, if I ever change what I'm putting in the summary, then I need to put that additional data into the vote document. Okay? So that might cause some issues, right? But this turns out this is very efficient because I only have to go do one lookup, one query, right? I only have to do one query and I get all of the data. Okay. One thing here, I might need to clarify some of these names. I might need to clarify some of the names in terms of like where do they fit in? Like, are they part of a quote unquote vote, or are they part of the user document, or are they part of the movie document? So oftentimes I might want to nest this data. So this might look like, rather than putting it all at the root, it could be helpful to do something like this and say, hey, I've got a movie property which contains a map, or basically an object, with the ID, so I've got the ID, the name, the director, the image, genre. Right? So if I nest that a little bit, it's maybe easier to keep track of those things. It also means I don't need to keep changing the names where I say movie ID, movie name, movie director. I can just kind of keep using the same names that I have in the movie document without having to clarify. So I actually would much prefer doing those things nested if we're going to add that additional data. Right? And it also makes it a lot clearer to see, okay, well, here's the data that I've copied. What is the data I've copied? What is the data I've chosen to not copy? Cool? Does that make sense? So I might structure the document more like this if that's what I want to do. Okay. What happens if I have the collection instead just has a minimal amount of data. Username, value, movie ID. The part you missed, I was saying I probably would nest that data, put it in a map rather than putting it.
Which one is it?
I can. Oh wait, that one's. Yeah, I can talk to it.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one way to solve it, and then I only have one query to run, right? But then I have to make sure that this data kind of stays in sync, right? I have to implement code potentially to keep that data in sync and update outdated votes potentially. But let's say I have, let's say I've voted on 10 movies. How many documents do I need to read for this solution? I need to read just 10 documents, right? If I've got 10 votes, then I've just got 10 reads. Okay? Because one of the things to keep in mind with Firebase is you're being charged based on the number of documents you read. Okay? So that's just 10 reads. What if I have the structure of my data this way? Yeah. So I have to get something from the movies collection as well, right? If this is all I have, then I need some data from movies, and I need some data from movie votes, right? So I'm going to need to run this query in addition to another query, okay? This query in addition to another query. So in this case, I need to run that query and db.collection movies to get all the movies, right? I need to take both of those queries and put them together. Now let's say there's 1,000 movies, and again, I voted on 10 of them. So 1,000 movies plus 10 votes which one's more expensive? That one, right? If that's all we're cared about in terms of reading and getting the results, this one will take a lot more reads to get the same results, right? Does that make sense? So I can potentially reduce the cost of that query if I go that route. Okay. Now, other thoughts. So that's the problem I'm trying to solve. I want to get it close. I want to reduce the number of reads. Is there any way that I can filter this down? Remember over there I do some sort of where, right? Is there a where clause here that I can use to reduce the number of reads I have to do? Can I reduce the number of reads I have to do? Rather than reading all of the movies, can I just read some of the movies? Okay. So what kind of where would that be? I'll get to you in a minute. Would that be a where equal to? Okay. So let's say here, that's what you're proposing, right? Okay. Let people stew on that for a minute. Evan, you had a hand up?
Yeah, it just doesn't look to me like there's anything you can do. You would have to write n number of, n represents the number of votes. N
You're
number
right.
of
Hold on to
queries.
that. You're right. Hold on to it. Somebody else had their hand up. Was it? Had somebody? I said had somebody else that had a hand up. Did you have a hand up? Was it you? Okay. So, can that work? How many results will that query give me? Think a little bit harder. How many results will that query give me? It will give me 0. That query will give me 0 results. Why?
There is no movie ID field.
Exactly. There is no movie ID field on the movie document itself. That will give me 0 results. Because for all intents and purposes, the movie ID is null.
How do you target that? How do you target that name to the document?
It's a good question, right? Or this is the ID of the document that I want to target, right? It's not a field on the document. The ID is not a field that's part of the document. Okay, so whatever name I put in here, there's an implicit assumption that that is a field on the document, but the ID is not a field. Okay. So what I need to do instead, this syntax does not work. That syntax does. If I want to look for a document by its ID, it's .document, not where equal to. Cool? Because where equal to is looking for a field, document is looking for a document with that ID. Okay? Also worth mentioning, this gives me back, where equal to gives me back a query. This gives me back a document reference. So there's a discrepancy in the return type for both of those as well. Okay. So what you said, Evan, was you could do this. This will give you back one document. And so how many times would I need to do that? If I do it this approach, well, then I need to read 10 votes first. And then once I have the votes, I can read the 10 movies that go with those votes. And so I have 20 reads. Does that make sense? But this does have to be sequential. I can't read and ask for the movies until I know what your votes are, right? The movies that I ask for depends on what your votes are. And so that also means if your votes change, I have to go run this again, right? So I actually kind of have to do basically, okay, I have to say get the votes, and then for each vote, get movie, right? I have to loop through, I have to say get votes for each of them, loop through and get the movies one by one. Okay. It's going to take a little bit longer. because I have to do 2 sequential queries. This way, I could ask for the movies and the votes at the same time because they're not independent of each other, right? And if the votes change, I don't have to ask for the movies again. Does that make sense? This first approach where I was asking for all the movies, if the votes change, then I just got the updated vote. So one vote changes, it's one read. Okay. This way, if the votes change, how many reads do I have to do? If my snapshot listener gives me a list of new votes, how many reads would I have to be doing here? Well, I go through all your votes again, and I make another 10 reads. Right? Because I have to read all the movies again. Does that make sense? I have to go ask for all those movies again, potentially. You have a hand up or just scratching? Okay. So you see the gotcha. There's a trade-off there, right? This is 20 votes. It's cheaper, at least for the first time I do it, but if I'm not careful, it actually might become more expensive, right? If I'm not careful, that approach could be more expensive than the first thing, especially if the users voted on all the movies, right? Say worst case scenario, there's 1,000 movies. The users voted on every single one of those. They watched them all. They're a movie buff. So they change one of their votes, and we have to read the entire list of movies. We have to do a for loop, and this for loop is kind of slow, so the user's sitting there for a few seconds before things happen, right? Or there's maybe a bunch of screen flicker potentially because we're loading in all that data. You kind of seen the trade-offs, right? So we've already looked at, there's at least 3 different ways to do this just from the server perspective, right? Okay? So which of these approach just from the first standpoint kind of, what leads to the fewest reads? Well, this, at least from our analysis so far, is the cheapest, right? Hands down, doing this, just dropping the data in here, is the cheapest way to do it. It's always 10 reads. If a vote changes, 1 read, because I just need data in one updated document. Cool. So it's cheap at the beginning, and it's also cheap going forward, right? Versus this one, well, I guess you still have 2 reads because you read the updated doc vote and you read the updated movie. If you're smarter than this, you just look at what's changed. So, but this one would be 1,000 up front, 10 up front, and then just one vote every time you get a change. Okay. One of the things that's missing from the analysis is that, remember one of the things I said is if the data changes, I may have to go update this movie object, right? If the movie data changes, then I have to go update the movie votes, okay? So there's a cost to writing data, right? And in fact, if you look at the pricing model for Firebase, there's one cost for a read, and there's a different cost for a write. And it's actually a little bit more. I think it was more like a factor of 4. I think it was something like 0.3 cents and 1.8 cents or something like that. Yeah.
So you kind of have to examine your application and see whether you're going to do more reads and writes or vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. So we do have to do a little bit of analysis and see how does that come up, right? Writes are one cost and reads are another cost, right? So if I say I take this approach and I go and update a movie, right? So let's say I go change the name of a movie. Now every vote for that movie potentially needs to get the updated name, okay? How many votes do I have to update?
Every single vote on that movie.
Every single vote on that movie. That's going to be not our 10 number here. That's going to be closer. It's not going to be on the order of the number of movies the users voted on. It's going to be on the order of the number of users. Okay, so let's say I've got, we have 1,000 movies, and I've got 100,000 users. 100,000 users, and half of them have voted on the movie. Half of them have seen it. So that's 50,000 vote documents. I go change the name of that movie, 50,000 rights. That's a big bill. It potentially could be a big bill. Probably still a few dollars, but that right there could charge you some change, right? Because I immediately have to go do that. And then also you have 50,000 reads potentially, because the users might be using your app at the time, and therefore they have to read the updated data, the updated vote documents. Not cheap. Okay? Not cheap. So, are there any ways that I can reduce those number of rights? Well, one option is to just not put the data there. Another option is don't update the data, right? A second option is to just say, oh, well, that's so costly. If the name changes, I'm just not going to update the movie name. I just won't put that code in. Is that a viable option? You're shaking your head and saying no. Probably not. Why not?
Now you introduce the problem for the user to see different values for whatever they interacted with in one place,
Right.
than in another.
So if I'm looking at a list of all movies, I'm going to see one name, and if I look at the list of just my movies in my library, I'm going to see a different name for the set for the same movie. Got it? I'm going to see a different name. Okay. So that might be a problem. Just for a mental thought, though, let's say somebody gets in your system and gets escalated in permissions to the point where they're able to edit movies and maybe they shouldn't have. And so they maliciously go change the names of those movies. In that case, do you want to update the things in the library? Maybe not, right? So there is a little bit of a risk there that maybe the permissions to edit your library are maybe yours, but other people have permission to change the database as a whole, right? So you're also kind of inheriting risk in that now other people can kind of change your library if you duplicate those rights, if you try to keep that data in sync. Does that make sense? So there's actually a security concern there too, right, to some extent. What happens if you have malicious actors, right? If I keep the data the same, then if somebody defaces the list as a whole, right, it doesn't deface my library. Okay, so there's those things. Now let's take this out of the context of movies and put this in a different context. Let's say these are products. Okay, let's say these are products, and let's say this is Amazon, right? If somebody goes in and changes the name of the product, should that update the name of the product in your previous orders? If I, maybe as the manufacturer of the product, decide I'm going to change the name of the product from this to this, say, hey, this is no longer, this listing used to be for the 2020 release of this tablet, and now I'm going to update the listing, and now it's the 2022 model of said tablet. Should what was in my order from 2020 change? No, right? Because I ordered the 2020 model, not the 2022 model, right? So it doesn't make sense for me to update the data there, because what I really want is the data from a historical standpoint. Does that make sense? So there are plenty of cases where you want that historical data not to change. Okay, that's a harder argument to make here with movies, because it's like, would that really happen? What does that mean to change the name of a movie? And in reality, how often do the names of movies change?
Never.
They don't, right? Once you release a movie, once it gets to theaters, do you get the opportunity to change the name of that movie? No, it's already been released, right? So actually the norm is that data doesn't change. The list of movies is largely static, it's fixed. Once you put that data in there, it shouldn't change. Now, cases where the movie might change before it's released, right? They might change the release date, they might change the director that's on it, and the name of the movie could change. All of those things are up for grabs before the movie's released. Okay. Should users be able to vote on a movie before it's released? No, they haven't seen it, right? So there's a mitigating factor there that we could say, okay, let's add a flag to mark the movie as released or not released, right? Once it becomes released, the data can't be changed, right? You can't vote on a movie that's not released, so that's that issue solved. And then once it's released, you can't edit the movie. Done. I never need to do 50,000 rights. Does that make sense? Now, what happens if I go through that thinking and say, okay, I can edit a movie as long as it's unreleased, and I can't edit when it's released? What if there's an error that gets into there, and now I have a released movie that's got a mistake on it? Should I then let users go in and fix said mistake and trigger 50,000 rights? Do I have another alternative? Well, what I can do is I can say, let's not edit that existing movie. Let's create a new one and edit the fixed version, right? So I have the fixed version, the corrected version, and the uncorrected version. And maybe I just keep both of those movies. Reasonable? What's the downside of keeping both the fixed, the corrected, and the uncorrected?
You can find them both in search results.
Right. But can I fix that problem?
I guess not.
I can, right? So I said I can add a Boolean flag to mark it released or unreleased. I can also add a Boolean flag to say this is like active or inactive, right? So if I say, okay, well that old copy is inactive, goes away from search results because you can't see inactive or items in the search results. Kind of think about like what we would do with the bug database. You have closed bugs and you have open bugs. We'll just mark it closed, right? So we can take something out of the search results by just changing the data, right? Does that make sense? So one way to solve that very problem is to say, hey, I want to work around and not have those extra rights when the data changes. Well, maybe I just make two movies, and that way the data's not really out of sync. Does that make sense? So there's a bunch of ways you can fix it, right? And that option of just don't update the data is actually an option, right? Oftentimes that may seem like a really weird thing to do, to not keep the data in sync. Actually, sometimes you want it. And sometimes it fixes issues like, hey, 2020 model and 2022 model are on the same listing, which happens, unfortunately, on Amazon quite a bit, where they'll change one listing from this one product description to another product description so that they can keep all the reviews.
Oh, that's why they're doing that?
Yes. So that they can keep the X4, 4.5 stars, and all the reviews that go with it. And so then you're carrying all these reviews from 2020 model to 2022 model. That's why they're doing that. Huh? It is absolutely shady, but it is happening. It is very, very shady, but several companies are doing that. Especially tech companies.
Is there any sort of law against that? Like,
No, there are none. There are no laws against that. That's perfectly legal, but it is happening. And unfortunately, because you can do that, another thing that's actually happening is hackers are getting into some manufacturers' eBay accounts or Amazon accounts. They'll grab that listing that's got 1,000 reviews, 4 stars, and they'll just hijack it and put in their own product. And now the reviews have nothing to do with it. The reviews were all written for product A, and now it's actually product B. That's also happening, right? Because you can hack somebody's account, steal their credentials, and take their storefront. So, again, you may want to keep the old data, right? So that makes sense. So one option is there's 2 options that we've already talked about. One option is I just don't include the data, then I don't have to worry about it. A second option is I do put the data in there, but I don't bother updating it. Okay. A third option is I could say, well, what if I do need to update all the data? Okay. Do I have to do it all at once? Do I have to do those 50,000 writes at once? I don't, right? I could spread that out and say, well, we'll do 10,000 writes. We'll do 10,000 of those updates per day. And I'll just spread it over 5 days. Or I might spread it over 5 months, say, okay, so because I only have to be billed for some of the writes this month, some of the writes this month, some of the writes that month, maybe I just say, hey, the data is going to be out of sync for a while, but to reduce how much I pay per month, I'm going to spread it out and do it over several months' time. Does that make sense? One way to reduce the cost. The other reason I might want to do that is if we find one mistake on a movie, there's likely to be more mistakes on that movie, right? Or if there's one error on a product, there's likely to be more than one error on the product. So I don't want to be charged 5 times for updating the same product, right? So it might be better to just say, okay, there's a change, we'll remember it, we'll fix it at the end of the day, right? We'll set up a job that runs at midnight, and that way if you find there's 5 different details on that product that are different, I'll fix it in that nightly job and only be charged once rather than being charged 5 times. So you can edit it multiple times. Or same thing with, you could say on a weekly basis, we'll update it, synchronize it every week rather than every day, right? So we can save money by amortizing or doing it less frequently, right? Not doing it immediately when the data changes. Cool? Questions? You following where I'm kind of going with this? So there are a lot of options there. Okay. Another option I have as well, let's go back to my users. Okay, let's say I have 100,000 users. Are all of those users active? Maybe not. Okay, so let's say I've got 100,000 users in my database, but only 10,000 of them are active. Only 10,000 are regularly using the website. 90,000 of that user base hasn't logged in for over a year. Do I care about the data of those 90,000 users? Do I care about keeping that data in sync? Huh? Not until they come back, right? So I might say, let's not update all of these let's only update it for my active users. And yeah, when they return, then I'll have to kick off the job and update those users. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of ways that you can split it up and say, I don't have to update all of the data, and I maybe just have to update some of the data, right? Cool. Keep all of those in your back pocket, okay? Because there's a bunch of different ways to solve that, okay? But you can see that there's a lot of thought that you have to be actually putting into something like this, because it's do I need to keep the data in sync, and how am I going to keep the data in sync, right, from a cost perspective? So I would say, though, one thing that's pretty obvious here is that this approach has the fewest reads. You can see that, right? And the other thing to keep in mind is that, as I said, it's very unlikely for the data to change, right? This data will not change or shouldn't change after the movie is released, right? So if I make that assumption that the data is not going to change after the movie is released, then I kind of don't need to update it. Cool. There's a lot of cases like this where you just have data, you just have collections that don't change ever. Similarly with consoles, how often does the consoles list change? Once every few years, right, when a new console comes out. So those are some thoughts. Does that help for everybody? Kind of making sense? So if I do this query, if I do it this way, how much work is the client doing in terms of putting the results set together?
Absolutely no work.
Basically no work, right? All the work happens on the server side if I do this. I do have some additional work when I insert a vote. When I make a vote, I may have to do some extra work because I have to send up some extra data. But overall, this is less work for the client. Okay? Second approach. Let's say I get all of the movies and all of the votes. Which is doing them, and then putting that together and saying, hey, here's just the movies I voted on. What's doing most of the work? The client or the server?
I would say the server, because it's returning all the movies. Could be a long list.
Okay. Could be a long list. But once I get those results, can I immediately show that to the user in terms of just filtering it down to those 10 movies? No. So I still have some work to do on the client, right? So this requires more work on the client because I have to merge those two lists on the client, okay? It does require, yes, a lot of work on the server because not really necessarily a lot of work because I just say get everything, but a lot of data to be transferred, right? It's a very easy operation on the server, but I don't have to do a join or anything like that because joins are not cheap, talking in SQL world. But it does have to send a lot of data, okay? Second approach, let's say that I go through, I get all the votes, and then I loop through and get movie by movie, okay? Well, this is a very easy thing on the server, right? Because I'm only asking for, I ask for all the votes, and I ask for one movie at a time. Very easy queries for the server to answer. Not going to require a lot of horsepower on the server side. Make sense? But it is going to require a bit more horsepower on the client side, right? And so this depends a little bit more on the speed of the user's hardware. Does that make sense? Okay. Because this is running one query, and it's all happening on the server, the results are going to be as fast as possible because their device doesn't have to do a bunch of crunching on it. This one, we have to make one query, and then make another query, and then make another query, and then make another query. So here, if I've got 10 votes, I'm making 11 queries. I'm making 11 trips to the database. You see the problem? If I run those sequentially, let's say each of those takes 100 milliseconds. How long does the whole thing take? 1.1 seconds. Multiply that out to, let's say they voted on 100 movies now. How long does this take?
10 seconds.
10 seconds. 10 whole seconds to get the movies that I voted on. That's slow, right? Versus that one was 100 milliseconds for 100 movies, for 100 votes. 100 milliseconds, 10 seconds. 100 milliseconds, 10 seconds. Which one is going to have our users running away and writing bad reviews? That one. So if that's going to have the users writing bad reviews, and that's not, is it worth taking the cost of potentially having to sync the data? How much is a few bucks in the grand scheme of things if you're going to keep your users happy? Right? Because that's the other side of things, right? This is going to be slow, that's going to be fast. But also notice there where it became slow, right? This approach was fast as long as I only had a small database, a small number of users, right? If I only have 5 games in my library, you're not going to notice the difference between these two. Barely. You'll barely notice the difference. But if I've got 10,000 games and the user's got 1,000 games in their scene library, you're gonna notice the difference, right? Does that make sense? Right? So there's a lot of considerations to make. You have to count up how many reads am I going to be doing, how many writes am I going to have to do, and what's going to actually be the query performance, what's going to be the latency experience from the user's perspective, right? So there's at least 3 solutions, and they have different pros and advantages, and it depends on what you're looking at. Cool? Okay. So given all that, which approach do you think I want to go down? Which approach do you think I should go down and do? Okay. So this is A. This is B. This is C. So, hands up for A, hands up for B, hands up for C. Okay, so you're the one voting, you're the only vote that I see 2 votes for C. Why C? Okay. So your defining perspective is you don't want to change the color.
So you have to remember vote option C is the one where you have to write n queries for each vote. So that ends up being, if each one's 100 milliseconds, like you said, that's a second to get 10 of them.
Now, one thing just for perspective, I do have to write, this query has to happen before these. I kind of intentionally eliminated a little complexity in talking about that. These requests are actually all asynchronous. All of these requests to get the movies can actually be done in parallel. So in reality, assuming you're asking for a relatively small number of movies, this would just be 200 milliseconds. Right? So actually for 10 movies, it would actually be more like 200 milliseconds and not a whole second, right? Because you can do these second ones and they will be done in parallel. Okay, they will be done at the same time. The gotcha is there is a limit to that where I can only make so many queries in parallel. There is a limit to how much network bandwidth you have and how much processing power you have on the smartphone, right? So let's say my limit is I can do 10 queries in parallel, and I've got 100 votes. Well, I still have to do 10 of those. So it still ends up being somewhat sequential. Make sense?
The reason why I'm not liking those option C now is because as the user gets more involved with the application, it's only going to get slower and slower for them.
Which is a really important thing to consider, right? So what you just said is your active users will have a worse user experience with this. Your active users, your dedicated users, are the most likely ones to give you a bad review and leave. Yeah, you were saying?
It seems like a red flag.
Yes. Yes, right. So yeah, I'm over here. Let's do that. That's going to require some changes to the code, but that's what I want to do. Yeah.
But just to be clear, option B, it's consistently, even though it's kind of poor, option B is consistently poor. So you can always rely on it.
Yes.
So you don't have to worry about
option B.
scalability here.
Option B is actually not that bad. The reason that option B is not that bad is think about where the user starts. What list are they going to look at first? All of the movies. So you already have to download all of the movies, or you already have to download some list of the movies. Not necessarily all of them, but you have to download at least the first page of results anyway, right? So it might be that you have to do these 1,000 reads anyway. User might already have that data on their device. So in some sense, those first 1,000 reads might be free because you've already paid for them. That's the hidden cost as well. The problem is that if I need to do paging, and let's say let's expand this to a little bit larger. Let's say I've got 1 million movies in the database. What if my user doesn't have enough space to store 1 million movies? Okay. What if they don't have enough space on their device to store 1 million movies?
That goes into memory, right?
Well, you're talking about memory, and you're also talking about device storage, right? So device storage, you might have enough room for 1,000, a million movies in their local file system. But things are pretty cramped on mobile devices, right? If you think about the average mobile device, it's got, what, 8 gigs, 16 gigs of storage. How often have you run up to that and had to go delete all your entire music library or delete old photos, right? If you see that you've got an app and it's used up 500 megabytes of storage and you're running out of space, what app do you delete? Using 500 megabytes of storage. So this also potentially taking this approach of needing to store all the movies, because in order to do this approach, I do actually need all the movies. To do option B, I do actually need to download the entire database. That could be a problem. Could lead to you being uninstalled because you're using so much data on their phone. Other thing to consider, how long is it going to take to download a million movies? A lot of time. So let's say your user goes and installs the app and then immediately goes and downloads all of the movies from the server. So they're waiting on a loading screen for a minute, say it's a minute, and then they can finally use your app because they've got a good internet connection. It takes a minute. Okay? How likely are they to use your app versus your competitor's app that loads in a second?
Not very likely.
I'm going to try those two apps and say, oh, well, this one loads up in a minute, this one loads up in a second. I only want to go get my answer, and I can go in this other app and get not only get the app started and get my movie tickets. I can go over here and register my movie tickets and buy them in a minute. And here it takes a minute to just start the app. This guy's going to get more movie purchases, right? So there's a lot of trade-offs there, right? And also just thinking about, talking about fast connection, right? Connection speeds are not all the same. Connection speeds in the US are actually pretty fast by most standards. Say I go take that overseas, it's now 15 minutes instead of 1 minute. I'm going to give up on that app before I even get it started. Oh, and by that way, while I'm downloading all those movies, I'm being charged data. And so not only did I wait 15 minutes, I spent X number of dollars to download all those movies. Right? So, again, you're seeing the trade-offs, right? Because what I want to page the data, I don't want to download all the data. And either A or C still lets me not download the entire database. Cool? Okay. Do you understand, as at least the discussion, the analysis helped maybe illuminate some of the things you need to think about? These are things you have to think about regardless of what database you're building, regardless of what database you're using, what you're building. You have to think about some of those costs and some of those trade-offs. What's going to add up the best, and not just go off with what's the easiest thing to program, right? Because there's a lot more things to consider. Okay? All right. So that's my goal, is I'm going to go for option A. So one of the things that I need to do is change